Fleet Admiral Voss Karath watched it from the command deck of the Eternal Spear and felt, for the first time in 31 years of military command, something that he was not immediately able to name. It was not quite satisfaction. It was not quite relief. It was the particular sensation of a predator that has driven its prey into a corner and is now watching the prey run, and the sensation was complicated by the fact that the prey was not running the way prey usually ran. The human fleet was pulling back in perfect formation. That was the thing that did not fit. In Karath's 31 years, he had seen many retreating fleets. He had caused most of them. Retreating fleets were ragged things. They broke formation under pressure. Individual commanders made local decisions that prioritized survival over coordination. The fastest ships moved first and the slower ones were left exposed. Retreating fleets looked like what they were, which was collections of beings trying to get away from something. The human fleet did not look like that. Every vessel was moving on a calculated vector. The spacing between ships was maintained with precision. The rearguard was rotating coverage in a pattern that meant any pursuit would face active defensive fire from at least 3 angles at any given moment. The whole formation was moving, but it was moving in a way that suggested the people inside it had planned this exact movement in advance. Subcommander Veth, standing at the tactical display to Karath's left, said what Karath was thinking. "They are very organized for a fleet that is retreating." "Yes," Karath said. "It could be a delaying action, draw us forward and strike from a prepared position." Karath had considered that. He had read the human tactical files. He had read them more carefully than most of his counterparts, because Karath had a specific professional habit of reading the files of any species he was likely to engage before he engaged them. The files on humanity were extensive, and they described, among many other things, a species with a documented preference for prepared defensive positions, and a willingness to absorb initial losses in order to create favorable conditions later. He had considered the delaying action hypothesis. He had considered it seriously. But the geometry of the withdrawal did not support it. The human fleet was not moving toward any position that his sensors could identify as strategically significant. They were moving toward open space, toward a region of the system that contained nothing of military value, no asteroid fields to use as cover, no gravitational anomalies to exploit, no previously identified installation or cached resources. They were just moving away. He looked at his tactical officer, casualties. The tactical officer checked his display. Their last engagement cost them approximately 30% of their forward line. We destroyed 11 cruisers and damaged another 15 significantly. He paused. Our own losses were 8 ships destroyed, 22 damaged. Karath nodded. The exchange ratio was favorable. Not as favorable as he would have liked, because human ships had a habit of fighting past the point where the tactical calculus said they should have stopped, but favorable. He watched the retreating formation. "Follow them," he said, "maintain pressure, do not let them consolidate." Veth said, "If it is a prepared position." "They are moving away from every prepared position we have identified," Karath said. "Follow them, keep distance. Do not allow them to reform." The Eternal Spear and its fleet accelerated in pursuit. In the command center of the Alliance heavy cruiser Resolute, Captain Yara Chen watched the Karath fleet begin its pursuit and felt the particular focused calm that she associated with plans working as intended. She was 38 years old. She had spent 14 years in the Alliance fleet and had been in command of the Resolute for 3 of those years, through 2 major engagements and a series of smaller actions that had taught her things about large-scale tactical coordination that she could not have learned any other way. She was good at her job. She knew she was good at her job, not with arrogance but with the quiet precision of someone who has tested herself repeatedly and knows what the results have been. She looked at the tactical display. The Karath fleet was moving as predicted. She had predicted it would because Karath was a predictable commander in a specific way. He was extremely good at conventional engagement. He was aggressive, well-coordinated, and resourceful within the tactical vocabulary he had developed over 30 years. What he was not, and what the Alliance intelligence assessment of him had noted carefully, was flexible in the deeper sense. He had a framework for how battles worked, a set of fundamental assumptions about the relationship between advance and retreat and victory and defeat, and those assumed. Emptions were, in the current engagement, exactly what she needed them to be. She opened the fleet channel. "All units," she said, "Phase 2, confirm readiness on my mark." The confirmations came back, every unit, in sequence, in order. She looked at Commander Osai across the command deck. Osai was her tactical officer and had been for 2 years, and they had the particular working relationship of people who had been in enough difficult situations together that communication between them had been reduced to its most efficient possible form. Osai was looking at the readiness board. She nodded once. Chen said, "Mark." Karath noticed the first signal change 7 minutes into the pursuit. It was subtle, a slight adjustment in the energy signature of the rearmost human vessels. Not weapons charging, not shields reconfiguring, something else. Something his tactical system flagged and then could not immediately categorize. He said, "What is that?" His tactical officer looked at the reading. "It is a power redistribution," he said. "They are moving energy from propulsion to other systems." "Other systems," Karath said. The tactical officer worked his display. He was quiet for a moment that was slightly too long. Then he said, "Weapons, sir. They are redistributing power to weapon systems, all of them, simultaneously." Karath looked at the tactical display. The human fleet was still moving away from him. The formation had not changed. The vectors had not changed. They were still retreating. But every ship in the formation was redistributing power to weapons. Veth said very quietly they were not retreating. "No," Karath said. "Then what were they doing?" Karath watched the display. He watched the human fleet, which was still moving away from him, which was still in perfect formation, which was now powering weapons across every ship simultaneously. He thought about the exchange ratio from the last engagement. 30% of their forward line, he had said. 11 cruisers destroyed, 15 significantly damaged, and his own losses, which he had characterized as favorable but which were, when he thought about it with fresh eyes in this specific moment, more significant than he had been treating them. He thought about where the human fleet was going: open space, no prepared positions, no strategic resources. He thought about the human tactical files, the preference for prepared defensive positions, the willingness to absorb initial losses. He thought about a fleet that retreated in perfect formation, that maintained spacing, that ran a rotating rearguard coverage with precision, that redistributed power to weapons while still moving away from him. He thought, what does a fleet do when it retreats in perfect formation to open space with no cover and no prepared positions? The answer arrived in his mind with the particular cold clarity of a realization that comes too late. It consolidates. It was not a retreat. It had never been a retreat. It had been a withdrawal to a consolidation point, and the consolidation point was open space because open space had one specific tactical property that everything else in the system lacked. No obstacles, full 360-degree engagement range, every ship with clean firing solutions in every direction. Karath had been pursuing a fleet that was drawing him forward into exactly the position it wanted him in. He said, "All units hard stop, reverse thrust, now." The eternal spear began to decelerate. Around him, the fleet responded, but deceleration at this scale was not immediate. They had been accelerating in pursuit for 7 minutes. Stopping would take time. On the tactical display, the human fleet completed its power redistribution. Then it stopped retreating. The second phase lasted 42 minutes. Karath would reconstruct it later, in the detailed after-action analysis that he was required to produce for the Imperial command, and that he produced with the thoroughness of someone who had made a significant error and needed to understand it completely. He would reconstruct it in precise tactical terms, vector by vector, engagement by engagement, the full sequence of what had happened when a fleet he had believed was retreating turned around. In the immediate experience, it was different. In the immediate experience, what happened was that the human fleet, which had been moving away from him in perfect formation for 7 minutes, completed a reversal that should not have been tactically feasible for a fleet of its size and composition. And it completed that reversal while maintaining the formation integrity that had characterized its retreat, and then it was no longer retreating. It was advancing. Not in the direction it had come from, in every direction. The formation expanded outward, each element moving to a pre-calculated position, and the expansion covered the approach vectors that Karath's pursuing fleet had been occupying, and the weep. Ons that had been redistributed power during the retreat were fully charged, and the firing solutions that open space provided with no obstacles were immediate and clean. The Eternal Spear took the first hit 3 seconds after the human fleet completed its reversal. Karath held his command deck through the impact, and the reports that followed and kept his attention on the tactical display, because the tactical display was where the information was, and the information was what he needed. His fleet was decelerating, but the deceleration was not complete, and in the meantime the human fleet was pressing the advantage of its prepared position with the efficiency of something that had been waiting for this exact moment. Subcommander Veth was coordinating the response. Karath could hear the orders, the adjustments, the attempts to find the countermove inside what was happening. Veth was good. His fleet was good. They had 31 years of experience and genuine capability, and they were not going to simply be swept away. But they were not going to win this engagement either. Karath understood that within the first 9 minutes. He understood it with the professional clarity of a commander who has been trained to assess situations accurately regardless of preference. The situation was that he had pursued a withdrawing fleet into a position that the fleet had been designing since before the withdrawal began, and the position was excellent, and his own fleet was in the worst possible configuration for what was now happening, which was a close-range three-dimensional engagement against a force that had full positional advantage and fully charged weapons, and the particular combat intensity of a fleet that had been waiting for the moment it was now in. He thought about what Captain Chen, because it must have been Chen, because the intelligence files described Chen as the kind of commander who thought this way, had understood that he did not. He thought about the exchange ratio he had been satisfied with: 11 cruisers, 15 damaged, 30% of their forward line. He thought about what it meant when a fleet voluntarily ceded 30% of its forward line in an engagement. When it absorbed that cost without breaking formation, without losing coordination, without any of the signs of genuine distress that a fleet sustaining those losses should have shown. It had not been distress. It had been payment. They had been paying the cost of drawing him forward. They had been purchasing his confidence in the favorable exchange ratio and his certainty that the withdrawal was genuine and his willingness to pursue them into open space. They had paid 30% of their forward line to put him exactly where they wanted him. He opened the fleet command channel. All units, he said, defensive formation Sigma. We are not advancing further. We are consolidating and withdrawing in order. Veth said, Sir, we have not. We have not won, Karath said, and we will not win this engagement. The question now is what we preserve. He looked at the display, defensive formation Sigma. Now. The defensive formation held for 21 minutes before Karath was able to complete the withdrawal with acceptable losses. Acceptable was doing significant work in that assessment. 3 more destroyers lost. 7 vessels requiring immediate repair attention. The Eternal Spear itself had taken 4 hits, 2 of which had damaged secondary systems that would need dockyard attention before the ship was fully operational. But he had gotten most of his fleet out. He sat in his command chair as the Eternal Spear moved away from the engagement zone, and he looked at the tactical display that now showed the human fleet holding its consolidated position, not pursuing, not pressing the advantage further, just holding. That was interesting. They could have pursued. The momentum of the engagement was with them. The exchange ratio had reversed significantly from what it had been before the second phase. They could have pressed. They did not. He thought about why. Then he said to his communications officer, open a channel to the Alliance fleet. Standard diplomatic frequency. The officer looked at him, Sir. I'll open it. There was a pause, then channel open, Sir. Karath said, This is Fleet Admiral Voss Karath of the Imperial Advance Fleet. I am addressing the commander of the Alliance force. I would like to speak with you. The channel was quiet for a moment, then a voice came back, clear, calm, female. Admiral Karath, this is Captain Yara Chen of the Alliance Fleet. What can I do for you? He thought about what to say. In 31 years, he had not made many calls like this. He had not had reason to. He found the precise words slowly because they needed to be precise. I would like to understand what just happened, he said. A brief pause, which part specifically? He looked at the tactical display, the withdrawal, it was not a ray. A trade. Another pause, then Chen said, No, it was not. You absorbed the losses from the first engagement deliberately to encourage pursuit. Oh, yes. You coordinated the power redistribution during the withdrawal without slowing the formation. Oh, yes. You planned the consolidation point before the engagement began. Oh, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, At what point did you decide the engagement would develop this way? Chen said we made plans for several contingencies. This was the most likely one given what we knew about your tactical preferences. She paused. The withdrawal worked because you pursued. If you had not pursued, we had a different plan for that. Karath looked at the tactical display. The human fleet, stationary in open space, holding a position that he was no longer capable of challenging in any productive sense. He said you did not pursue after the second phase. No, Chen said. Why? She was quiet for a moment because we had achieved our objective. She paused. We did not need to destroy your fleet. We needed to stop your advance. We have stopped it. He considered this. She was right. The advance was stopped. The strategic situation had not changed in a direction that favored the alliance beyond that, and pursuing a partially damaged Imperial fleet that still had considerable defensive capability would cost alliance ships and lives for gains that were not necessary to achieve the objective. She had not pressed the advantage because she did not need the advantage beyond what she already had. That was a different kind of thinking from what he had been applying. He had been thinking about the engagement as a thing to be won in the comprehensive sense, an enemy fleet to be destroyed, a field to be dominated. She had been thinking about it as a tool for achieving a specific outcome, and she had calibrated everything, including her own losses, to that outcome. He said, "You are very precise in your objectives." Chen said, "We try to be." She paused. "Admiral, can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." She said, "When did you realize the withdrawal was not a retreat?" He thought about the moment, the energy redistribution, the tactical officer's too long pause before identifying the target of the power redistribution, the cold clarity of the realization. 7 minutes into the pursuit, he said. "And you called the hard stop immediately." "Oh, yes." She said, "That was fast. Most commanders in your position would have taken longer to revise the assessment." She paused. "I want you to know that the hard stop saved a significant portion of your fleet. If you had not called it when you did, the second phase would have been considerably worse for you." He looked at the tactical display. He understood what she was doing. She was not gloating. She was giving him precise information about the engagement, delivered with the directness of one professional to another. He said, "You had planned for the hard stop response as well." "Yes, if you had called it earlier, we had a plan for that. If you had called it later, the second phase would have been more damaging to your fleet." She paused. "You called it at approximately the optimal time given what you knew and when you knew it. I want you to know that I consider that a significant achievement under the circumstances." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are a very unusual commander, Captain Chen." She said, "I have been told that before." He said, "I am going to withdraw from this system. I will need to file an engagement report with Imperial Command, and I will need time to assess the strategic situation." She said, "Of course, we will not interfere with a withdrawal conducted in order." He said, "You planned for that as well." She said, "We plan for most things, Admiral." He said, "I believe you." The channel closed. He sat in the command chair for a while looking at the tactical display. Then he said to nobody in particular, "She planned for the channel call." Veth, who was standing nearby and had heard the exchange, said, "Sir." Karath said she was ready for me to call. She knew how to talk to me, what information to give and how to give it. She said the hard stop was a significant achievement. She knew I needed to hear that. She knew I was a commander who had just lost an engagement, and she managed the information precisely to give me what I needed to withdraw with my dignity intact and my fleet in order. He looked at Veth. She planned for me to make that call, and she had a plan for the call. He shook his head slowly. She plans for everything. Veth was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Is that why she did not pursue?" Karath thought about it. Partly, she did not need to pursue to achieve her objective, but also, he paused. She knew I would need to file an engagement report. She knew Imperial Command would want to know what happened. If she had destroyed my fleet, the report would describe a catastrophic loss, and Imperial Command would respond by scalating, by committing more resources to recover prestige and position. He looked at the display. "By letting me withdraw with most of my fleet, the loss is significant but not catastrophic. The engagement report describes a tactical reversal, not an annihilation. Imperial Command can respond with increased caution rather than increased force." She paused on the edge of victory and chose to leave me with enough to make de-escalation possible. Veth stared at him. "That is extraordinary." Yes, Karath said it is. He stood up from the command chair. Get me a line to Imperial Command, he said. I need to file the engagement report, and I need to recommend something that I have never recommended before in 31 years. The engagement report took 3 days to write. It was by the standards of Imperial engagement reports unusual. Karath had always written his reports with precision and without self-serving interpretation. He described what had happened and why, and what the lessons were with the same clinical thoroughness whether the engagement had gone well or badly. This was one of the qualities that had kept him in command for 31 years despite the occasional bad outcome, because Imperial Command trusted his assessments because his assessments were honest. This report was honest. It described the initial engagement and the exchange ratio and the withdrawal and why he had interpreted the withdrawal as a genuine retreat. It described the pursuit and the realization and the hard stop and the second phase. It described the losses with precision. It described the channel communication with Captain Chen and his analysis of that communication. In the recommendations section, he wrote, "This engagement demonstrates a capability in alliance tactical planning that I had not previously encountered in this form. The human fleet did not retreat. They withdrew to a prepared consolidation point in a manner specifically designed to encourage pursuit and induce the pursuing force into an unfavorable engagement geometry. Every element of the action was pre-planned, including the response to multiple contingencies including an early pursuit termination and a late pursuit termination. The withdrawal absorbed significant losses without operational disruption, indicating either extraordinary discipline or extraordinary confidence in the overall plan, likely both." He wrote, "The commander of the Alliance fleet, Captain Chen, demonstrated an understanding of operational objectives that goes beyond tactical engagement. She did not pursue after achieving positional advantage because pursuit beyond the achievement of her objective was unnecessary and would have created conditions unfavorable to strategic de-escalation. She managed the post-engagement communication specifically to create conditions for an orderly Imperial withdrawal that preserved the possibility of a negotiated resolution." He wrote, "My recommendation is that we do not interpret this engagement as a temporary setback to be recovered through escalation. This was not a failure of execution that more ships will correct. This was a demonstration of a fundamentally different approach to conflict, one in which every action is calibrated to a precise objective, and the objective is not the destruction of the enemy but the achievement of a specific strategic state. Escalating our commitment without understanding and adapting to this approach will produce further engagements of this type, with outcomes that are unlikely to improve with scale." He wrote, "I recommend opening diplomatic channels, not from a position of weakness, from a position of professional recognition that the Alliance fleet in this engagement demonstrated the kind of thinking that does not improve its track record under sustained military pressure, and that continuing military engagement without diplomatic parallel is strategically unsound." He submitted the report and waited. Imperial Command's response arrived 18 hours later. It did not contain approval for his recommendation. It did not contain disapproval. It contained a single instruction. "Come home, we need to talk." He went home. The conversation with Imperial Command lasted 5 days. It was not, as Karath had expected, primarily a conversation about the engagement itself. The strategic and tactical details had been covered in the report. Imperial Command had understood them. What Imperial Command wanted to discuss was something broader. They wanted to discuss the humans. Not in the context of this engagement specifically. In the broader context of what this engagement, combined with the previous 18 months of operations against human-aligned forces, indicated about who and what the Alliance was dealing with. Karath had been in rooms like this before. Rooms where the people with the broadest responsibility for Imperial strategy gathered to assess a situation that had not developed the way the initial assessment had predicted. He had been in those rooms as a junior officer and as a senior one, and he had learned to read them. He could read this one. Imperial Command was concerned. Not frightened, the distinction was important. Fear and concern looked similar from the outside but came from different places. Fear came from the sudden understanding that something was more dangerous than believed. Concern came from the more considered understanding that something had been misassessed, that the initial framework had been wrong, and that the wrong framework had been producing wrong responses, and that correcting this would require not just tactical adjustment but strategic reassessment. This was the second kind. The chief of Imperial strategy, an old being named High Commander Esrath who had served in that position for 20 years, laid it out in the flat, precise language that Esrath used for everything. We have been treating the Alliance engagement as a containment problem, Esrath said, a species expanding into territory that intersects with Imperial interests, requiring pressure sufficient to establish boundaries. This is a framework we have applied successfully in many contexts. He looked at Karath. Your report suggests the framework does not apply here. Karath said, the framework assumes that sufficient pressure eventually produces either accommodation or collapse. He paused. I do not think either of those outcomes is available against this opponent. Esrath said, because they absorb the pressure. Because they plan for it, Karath said, they do not just absorb pressure, they use it. The losses they took in the first phase of the engagement I described were not absorbed in spite of their plan. They were part of their plan. They paid those losses deliberately because paying them served the larger objective. He looked around the room. A species that can do that does not respond to pressure the way we expect. Increasing the pressure does not change the outcome. It changes the cost. Esrath said to us. To both sides, but we are paying more per unit of outcome than they are. He had thought about how to say this for 3 days. We are using a tool that is not suited to the material. When the tool does not cut the material, using the same tool harder does not solve the problem. The room was quiet. Then one of the other commanders, a young one named Sub-Commander Preth who had been listening carefully throughout, said, how did they develop this capacity? Is it training, doctrine, something in their nature? Karath thought about the question. He had thought about it on the journey home. He had read more of the human files on that journey than he had ever read before, specifically looking for the answer to this question. He said it is all of those things, but the deepest part of it is older than their current doctrine. It is something that comes from their history. He looked at the room. Humans have been fighting each other for 10,000 years, not small skirmishes. Major sustained conflicts that tested their capacity and forced innovation and cost them enormously. They developed over those 10,000 years a specific approach to conflict that is built on a foundational assumption that is different from ours. He paused. Our approach to conflict is built on the assumption that the goal is to defeat the enemy, he said. Their approach is built on the assumption that the goal is to achieve an objective. The enemy is one factor in achieving the objective, not the objective itself. He looked at Esrath. The difference sounds small. It is not small. It produces completely different decision trees, completely different assessments of what success looks like and what costs are acceptable. He paused. When we engage them, we are trying to defeat them. When they engage us, they are trying to achieve something. They accept whatever defeats are necessary to achieve it. We interpret those defeats as signs of weakness. They are not signs of weakness. They are investments. The room was very still. Then Esrath said, the engagement you described, Captain Chen's decision not to pursue. Yes, Karath said, she had achieved her objective. She did not need to destroy my fleet to achieve it. Destroying my fleet would have cost her ships and created conditions that were counterproductive to the larger objective. So she stopped. He looked at Esrath. In our framework, stopping when you have the advantage is failure of nerve. In her framework, stopping when you have achieved the objective is precision. Esrath looked at him for a long moment. Then, what do you recommend? Karath said, open diplomatic channels. Genuinely. Not as a delay or a negotiating tactic, with the actual intent to reach an agreement. He paused. Because if we continue military engagement without that, we will continue to pay the cost of using the wrong tool, and the cost compounds. He looked around the room. They planned for everything, he said. They planned for my channel call after the engagement. They planned for my engagement report and Imperial Command's likely response. I believe they have planned for this conversation as well. I believe they have a plan for what happens if we escalate and a plan for what happens if we negotiate, and both plans are built to achieve their objectives at the minimum necessary cost. He paused. The minimum necessary cost to defeat us is higher than they want to pay, he said. That is why Chen did not pursue. That is why they have been absorbing losses and drawing us forward and using the pressure we apply to set up the next position. They do not want to destroy us. They want us to stop. Esrath said, and if we stop? Karath said, then they will stop, because stopping will have achieved the objective. The room was quiet for a long time. The diplomatic channel opened 3 weeks later. The opening session was formal, as these things were. Both sides arrived with positions that had been prepared carefully and that did not represent the actual resolution but were necessary starting points from which the actual resolution could be approached. The positions were laid out, responses were registered. Proposals were made and noted. The process was slow and complicated and required patience that some of the people in the room found difficult and others had in abundance. Captain Chen was in the room for the alliance. She was not the lead negotiator. She was present as a military advisor, which was her correct role, and she did her role with the same precise calibration she brought to everything else. Admiral Karath was present for the Imperial side in the same capacity. He was not the lead negotiator either. He was there to advise and to observe. On the second day of the first formal session, during a recess, he found himself in a corridor outside the main chamber at the same time as Chen. This was, he realized, not entirely accidental. She had positioned herself there. He had been aware of this and had not avoided it. They stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she said, "You read the engagement report carefully." He said, "I wrote it carefully." She said, "I know I read it." She paused. "You were accurate about the channel call. I had prepared for it." He said, "I know." She said, "You also identified the reason I did not pursue, the de-escalation consideration." He said, "It was the logical interpretation." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." She said, "When you called the hard stop, in that moment what were you thinking?" He considered the question honestly. He said, "I was thinking that I had made an error of assessment and that I needed to stop making it worse." He paused. "I was thinking that the fleet I was pursuing was not doing what I believed it was doing, and that continuing to act on the wrong belief would continue to produce the wrong results." She said, "That is good thinking under pressure." He said, "I was trained for it." She said, "So were we." She looked at him. "Your training and our training are different in many ways. But that part is the same. When the situation changes, update the assessment. Do not continue acting on the old one." He said, "Yes." She said, "I think that is why this is going to work. The negotiation." He said, "You think it will work?" She said, "I think it will work because both sides have people in the room who are capable of updating their assessment when the situation requires it." She paused. "That is rarer than it should be." He looked at her, then he said, "You planned for the negotiation to work." She almost smiled. "We plan for most things, Admiral." He said, "I know." The recess ended. They went back into the room. The negotiation continued with the patience and the precision and the occasional frustration that these things required, and the people in the room who were capable of updating their assessments when the situation changed did that work, and it was slow and imperfect and more complicated than anyone would have liked. It worked. Karath wrote a second document after the negotiation concluded. It was not an engagement report. It was something more personal, a record of what the engagement and the negotiation had taught him that he did not want to lose. He wrote, "A fleet that retreats in perfect formation is not retreating. A fleet that absorbs losses without breaking coordination is not losing. A commander who stops pressing an advantage she holds is not weak. These are the things I did not understand at the start of the engagement at this system, and my misunderstanding of them cost the fleet I commanded a significant portion of its combat capacity." He wrote, "The lesson is not primarily tactical. The lesson is about assessment. I had a framework for what retreating fleets looked like and what withdrawing fleets looked like and what strength and weakness looked like, and I applied that framework to a situation where it did not fit, and I continue. De-applying it after the first indications that it did not fit, because revising the framework is more difficult than continuing to use it." He wrote, "Captain Chen's fleet did not do anything that was outside the range of what careful study of human tactical history would have predicted. The information was available. I had read the files. What I had not done was let the files change the framework. I had read them and fit them into the existing structure rather than allowing them to challenge it." He wrote, "The humans spent 10,000 years fighting each other and learning from every engagement. The learning was not incidental. It was central. The fighting was the mechanism and the learning was the point. They emerged from those 10,000 years with a relationship to conflict that is different from anything I encountered in 31 years of Imperial service, because they have been studying this specific problem for longer and at greater cost than anyone else in the region." He wrote, "What they know that I did not is that the withdrawal is part of the battle, that the retreat is sometimes the advance, that the losses you absorb deliberately are not the same as the losses you absorb because you had no choice, that the objective is not the enemy in front of you but the state of affairs you are trying to create, and that every action, including the ones that look like weakness, should be understood in relation to that objective." He closed the document. He thought about Chen in the corridor. The precise, careful way she had said, "I think it will work," because both sides have people in the room who are capable of updating their assessment when the situation requires it. He thought she had planned for that conversation too. She had said the exact right thing at the exact right time to a commander who needed to hear it before going back into a room to spend weeks working toward an outcome that required everyone present to continue functioning at their best. She planned for everything. He found, sitting with that thought, that he did not mind. He had spent 31 years in command and he had been good at it. He had learned from every engagement he had been part of. He had updated his assessments when the situation required it, or tried to more often than not. He had not been prepared for this. But he was prepared now. He closed the document, and he saved it. And he made a note to ensure it was incorporated into the Imperial tactical training curriculum. Because the people who came after him would face what he had faced, and they would need to understand it better than he had at the start. The thing he had faced was a species that had never confused a withdrawal with a defeat. That was the whole lesson. Everything else followed from it. If this story gave you that moment, that specific satisfaction when the Karath fleet realized the truth 7 minutes too late, if Admiral Karath sitting alone on his command deck saying she planned for the channel call landed with you exactly as it should have, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Every week we bring you the best HFY science fiction, stories about humanity that remind you of what we are when we are at our most precise, our most patient, our most relentlessly prepared. Subscribe right now, hit the bell. Share this story with someone today who needs to be reminded that the withdrawal is sometimes the advance and the retreat is sometimes the plan, and the species that learns from every engagement never truly loses. We are still here. We were always reloading. We are always still here. There is a training exercise in the Imperial Military Academy, now called the Chen Withdrawal. It was not named by the Academy itself. It was named by the cadets, in the way cadets name things that become important to them, the informal language of people learning something that matters. The formal designation in the curriculum is Tactical Withdrawal as Strategic Advance, a case study, but nobody calls it that. Everyone calls it the Chen Withdrawal, and the name has been in use for long enough now that it appears in the informal written materials. The cadets pass between each other as well as in the conversation. The exercise works like this. 2 groups of cadets are given an engagement scenario. One group is the pursuing force. One group is the withdrawing force. The withdrawing force is given a specific objective. The pursuing force is given the goal of engaging and defeating the withdrawing force. The exercise ends either when the pursuing force achieves a clear tactical victory or when the withdrawing force achieves its specific objective. In the first 3 years the exercise was run, the pursuing force won approximately 40% of the time. The specific objective built into the exercise for the withdrawing force was the same one Chen had used. Draw the pursuing force into a prepared position in open space, consolidate, and achieve positional D. Dominance without requiring the destruction of the pursuing force. The 40% figure bothered the Academy's tactical instructors until one of them identified the reason for it. The pursuing force, when told their goal was to engage and defeat the withdrawing force, interpreted defeat in the comprehensive sense. They were trying to destroy the withdrawing force. This made them aggressive in ways that created vulnerabilities. The withdrawing force, when told their objective was to achieve positional dominance without destroying the pursuing force, operated differently. They were precise. They were patient. They were willing to absorb losses that served the objective. They stopped when the objective was achieved. The 40% figure meant that 60% of the time, the withdrawing force won, even when the pursuing force had the initial engagement advantage, even when the pursuing force had superior numbers, even when the instructors weighted the scenario in favor of the pursuing force. The instructors presented this data to Admiral Karath, who had been brought in as a strategic consultant to the Academy 3 years after the negotiation concluded. He read the data and said, "Yes." The senior instructor said, "Can you explain why the disparity is so large?" Karath said, "Because the withdrawing force has a clearer understanding of what winning means." He looked at the data. They know what they are trying to achieve and they calibrate every action to that achievement. The pursuing force knows they want to defeat the withdrawing force, but defeat is a vague objective and vague objectives produce vague decision-making. He paused. Precision beats power when the precise side has enough power to remain in the field. The withdrawing force has enough power to remain in the field. The rest follows from the clarity of the objective. The senior instructor said, "How do we teach the pursuing force to match that clarity?" Karath said, "Teach them to ask what they are actually trying to achieve before they decide how to achieve it." He paused. The Chen fleet was trying to stop an advance. Every action they took was calibrated to that. If the pursuing force had been trying to stop the Chen fleet rather than defeat it, they would have made different decisions. They would have been less aggressive in pursuit. They would have been more attentive to indicators that the withdrawal was not what it appeared to be. The senior instructor thought about this. Then he said, "The framing of the objective determines the strategy." "Yes," Karath said, "and the framing of the objective determines what information seems important and what information seems irrelevant." He looked at the exercise data again. The pursuing force in these exercises ignores indicators that the withdrawal is a consolidation maneuver because those indicators do not fit the story they are telling themselves. They are telling themselves a story about a retreating enemy. Information that does not fit a retreating enemy is ignored or reinterpreted. He paused. Captain Chen understood that I would tell myself that story. She designed the withdrawal to fit the story perfectly until the moment it did not, and by the time the story broke, the geometry was already against me. The senior instructor said, "She designed the deception to exploit our own narrative." "Yes," Karath said, "she designed it to let us defeat ourselves." He paused. "That is a more efficient form of victory than defeating us directly. It requires less force. It produces the same result." He looked at the instructor. "That is the lesson, not that the Chen withdrawal is a maneuver to be copied, but that the deepest form of tactical advantage is understanding your opponent's narrative better than they do." The exercise was updated to incorporate this lesson. The pursuing force was now given a brief before the exercise that included the instruction, "Your goal is to stop the withdrawing force from achieving its objective. Define what their objective might be before you begin pursuit." The disparity in the outcomes shifted significantly. The pursuing force began winning more often, not because the withdrawing force had become less capable, but because the pursuing force had learned to ask the question that Karath had not asked until it was too late. What is the withdrawing force actually trying to do? Admiral Karath attended the exercise review sessions when he was available and watched the cadets work through the scenario with the particular attention of someone who had learned the lesson at full cost and found it useful to see others learning it at a fraction of that cost. He did not speak much during the sessions. He listened. He watched the moments when the pursuing force made the error he had made, and the moments when they caught themselves, and the moments when the lesson had been genuinely internalized rather than just applied as a checklist. The genuinely internalized cases were rarer, they were so the ones that produced the most interesting outcomes, because the cadets who had genuinely understood the lesson were capable of generating novel applications of it that Karath had not predicted, which told him something about the depth of the principle. After one session, a young cadet asked him, "Do you think the humans would have found a different approach if you had anticipated the withdrawal?" Karath said yes. The cadet said, "What would they have done?" He said, "Something I had not anticipated." He paused. That is the nature of a force that plans for contingencies. If your anticipated plan fails, you move to the contingency. If the contingency is anticipated, you move to the next one. The depth of the planning determines how many layers you have to work through before you reach something the opponent was not ready for. He looked at the cadets. The lesson, he said, is not that any specific maneuver is unbeatable. Every maneuver has a counter. The lesson is that a force which thinks clearly about objectives and plans carefully for contingencies will always be working from a deeper level of preparation than a force that does not. He paused. We did not think clearly enough about objectives before that engagement. We did not ask what they were actually trying to do. We assumed we knew. He looked at the cadet. Assuming you know is always the first error. The cadet wrote that down. Karath watched him write it and thought that this was perhaps the most useful thing that had come out of the whole sequence of events, the part that would outlast the individual actors and the specific engagement and even the negotiation. The lesson written down in a cadet's notes and eventually in the curriculum, and eventually in the understanding of officers who would face their own engagements and their own withdrawals and their own moments of realizing that the situation was not what they had believed. The lesson that the withdrawal is sometimes the advance. That the retreat is sometimes the plan. That the fleet that looks like it is running is sometimes the fleet that is loading. He stood in the Academy Training Center and looked at the exercise display and thought about a fleet in perfect formation moving away from him in the dark and redistributing power to weapons. and he thought about what it had taken to finally understand what he was looking at. He thought it is a lesson worth the cost. He thought not all lessons are. He went back to work. Captain Chen retired from the Alliance fleet 7 years after the negotiation concluded. Her retirement address to the fleet was brief, which was characteristic of her. She did not speak about the engagements she had been part of in detail. She spoke about the principle that had guided her approach to command. She said, "The question I have always tried to ask before any decision is what am I actually trying to achieve? Not what does success look like in the abstract. Not what would a victory look like to an outside observer. What is the specific state of affairs I am trying to create, and what is the minimum necessary action that creates it?" She paused. The minimum necessary, she said, is not the same as the least effort. Sometimes the minimum necessary is extremely difficult and costly. The Chen fleet at the engagement with Karath's force paid a significant cost in the first phase because that cost was the minimum necessary to achieve the positioning we needed. She looked at her officers. The question is not how to avoid cost. The question is whether the cost is necessary, whether it is proportional. Whether it is being paid in the direction of the actual objective, rather than in the direction of the story we are telling ourselves about the objective. She said Karath's fleet paid costs that were not necessary to achieve any realistic version of Imperial strategic objectives in that engagement. They paid those costs because they were pursuing a story about a retreating enemy, and the story required that they keep pursuing, and the costs kept mounting in service of a story that was not true. She looked at her officers. The most expensive thing in any engagement is the wrong story. I have tried to keep the story true. I have not always succeeded. But I have always tried. She said one more thing. She looked at the assembled officers. Karath is a good commander. He updated his assessment when the situation required it. He called the hard stop when he understood what was happening. He filed an honest report. He recommended negotiation when negotiation was the right answer. He spent 7 years teaching at the Imperial Academy, making sure the lesson reached the next generation of commanders. He paused. We were opponents in an engagement, and we have been colleagues in the work that followed, and I have respected him throughout both. She looked at her officers. Know your opponents well enough to respect what they do well. It makes you better, and it makes the world smaller in the way the world needs to be smaller. She stepped back from the podium. The fleet applauded. She went home. She had an early morning the next day, though it was not a command shift. It was the first morning of the rest of her life, which was not a battlefield and not a negotiating room but something else, something that had been waiting on the other side of all of it. She thought minimum necessary cost to achieve the objective. She thought, I know what I am trying to achieve. She smiled. She went to bed. Outside, the stars were where they always were. And in the space between them, the things that had been built by people who understood their objectives and calibrated their actions accordingly were still there. The fleet, the academy, the negotiation that had become an agreement that had become a reality that people were living inside of now, having forgotten that it had once been just a plan. A plan that had accounted for most contingencies, including this one. If this story gave you that feeling, that precise and satisfying moment when understanding arrives and everything that seemed like defeat reveals itself as design, then you know what this channel is made for. Every week we bring you HFY science fiction that finds the truth in humanity, the part of us that plans, that learns, that absorbs the cost and keeps moving, that knows the difference between retreating and reloading. Subscribe right now, turn on the bell. Share this story with one person today who needs to understand that the species that studies every engagement and learns from every loss and plans for every contingency is not a species you can defeat by pressing harder. We are still here. We were always reloading. We will always be reloading. We are always still here. The stars have always been patient. They have watched species rise and expand and conflict and learn and sometimes, not always but sometimes, find a way through to something better than what they started with. The stars do not prefer any particular outcome. They simply persist, which is a kind of patience that no biological being can fully imitate but many have tried to approximate. The humans came close. Not because they were patient by nature. They were by the assessment of every species that had encountered them among the least naturally patient beings in the region. They were restless and argumentative and driven by urgencies that other species found exhausting from the outside. They could not sit still for long. They were always building something, always revising something, always finding the thing that was wrong with the current approach and working to fix it. What they had was not patience. What they had was the specific discipline of people who know that the objective is worth whatever the timeline requires, and who had learned, at tremendous cost over 10,000 years, to hold that discipline even when the urgency was real and the cost was mounting, and every instinct said to press harder rather than to wait. Karath had written in his document, "They do not confuse a withdrawal with a defeat." The more precise formulation was, "They do not confuse the timeline with the outcome." The withdrawal takes as long as it takes. The reload takes as long as it takes. The negotiation takes as long as it takes. What matters is not the duration but the direction, and the direction was always the same. Forward. That was the whole of it. Everything else was detail. If this story is still with you, if the image of Admiral Karath watching a fleet in perfect formation and realizing 7 minutes too late what he was actually looking at stayed with you, if the Chen withdrawal is a lesson you will carry with you, then this channel is your home. Every week we bring the best HFY science fiction, the stories that find the truth in what humanity is. Patient when patience serves the objective. Relentless when relentlessness serves it. Always learning, always reloading. Always moving forward. Subscribe right now, hit the bell, share this with someone today. We are still here, we are always still here.